All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the ARC at Schools webinar, Free and Appropriate Education During COVID-19. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. All participants are currently in a listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity to ask questions following the presentation. However, at any time during the presentation, if you need assistance, please post the question in the chat box on the side of your screen, and we will do our best to assist you. This webinar is being recorded. The link to the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and any handouts for this presentation will be sent out to all attendees following this webinar. You will receive a feedback survey immediately following the webinar. Please take a few minutes to complete it and submit it back to us. It is very important that we get your feedback. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have Denise Stile-Marshall, CEO of Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, otherwise known as COPA, and attorney Amy Bond as our guest speakers today. I'll now turn it over to Denise to get things started.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. I really appreciate the introduction and the invitation to be here to speak to you all today. As we know, ensuring a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, is not easy in what some may call normal times, but it's certainly been more challenging during the COVID-19 year that we've been in so far and counting. So we're happy to be here today. Both Amy and I are part of COPA, and this is an issue that we and our members have been focused on, as everyone else has, throughout since COVID first began. One of the things, though, that we have really been from the day one when the Department of Ed sent out guidance or a memo about the COVID, they were not clear that a child is still entitled to FAPE. And so from day one, we've been raising our voice and reminding everyone that the IDEA has no provision for emergencies or shutdowns such as COVID, and that we are still in the business of making sure that it's implemented and creating opportunities, protecting rights, and changing the lives of students with disabilities. COPA doesn't focus on any one type of disability or age group other than birth through transitioning into higher education or employment. But our major focus of many members is on the K through 12. Again, this presentation is for informational purposes only. It's not legal advice. We can't answer questions about individual cases, but we do encourage you, if you need to check out and find counsel or an advocate or just another family in your area, we do have a directory on our website, which is www.copa.org. And there's a find the directory link there. Again, we're a nationwide peer-to-peer network. We've been working on protecting the civil rights of students and their families since 1998. We represent more than 250,000 families every year, attorneys, advocates, other family members, parents, related professionals, anyone who doesn't work more than 50% for a school district and is interested in protecting the civil rights of students with disabilities is eligible to participate. So if you're not yet a member, we certainly hope you might consider joining. There is certainly strength in numbers, and this is a powerful network. We collaborate with the ARC a lot, not only in training and for advocacy, but also on policy issues. Each year, we offer information, expertise, and legal insight to protect the interests of students with disabilities and their families. And we also submit a number of amicus briefs on cases that are of importance to us. And right now we are certainly keeping track of COVID-related cases to see if there's anything that may be precedent setting or something that we need to raise our voice on. for the first time in our history, in the past couple of years, we actually sued the Department of Education. So we were plaintiffs in litigation. And that was, again, to make sure that the law was followed and to try to find any avenue we can to, focus on the law and have it be implemented. As one of our former board members, Susan Bruce, used to say, COPA is everywhere. The voice of students with disabilities and their families need to be heard. And so that's from the IEP table through the due process hearings into appellate court level and all the way up to the Supreme Court. So, and policymaking in Congress. So we've had guiding principles from the very beginning of COVID, and those remain today. And that is that the rights that you all have under the IDEA and under other federal statutes have not changed. There's no waiver to them. There's no, when you start to hear a school personnel start the sentence with, well, I don't know if we have to implement the standard assessments this year. The answer is always, you do, because that's required and there's no waiver to that. The question is how you're going to do that and what's going to be most meaningful for the students that you're working with. So we want to make sure that folks know that the IDEA rights remain. There's been no waivers, again, at the federal level. We do know that there are some states who are working to see, and if you have other kind of training, you may remember that the IDEA is the floor of what's required, and that states may go over and above that. They cannot go below of what's required. So, for example, there's been a couple of states, New York and New Jersey, New York City in particular, I think, but I know the state of New Jersey that's looking at extending the eligibility age for students with disabilities. Many states, it's 21 to 22. Up to this point, there had only been one state that went all the way up to 26 in some instances. So there are states that are recognizing the learning loss and or possible need for learning recovery of some students, and they may be passing bills, or that might be something you might want to consider in your state. So keep your eye out for that. But the requirements for individualization, the schools still have to support your child's specific and unique needs, and they need to do that following the requirements of the law. So typically, if there's an annual IEP that occurs right before, at the end of the year, or whenever your IEP occurs, that needs to still occur, and they need to still look at the data, do assessments, have the team come together and figure out what the student should be working on. And only once that program is agreed upon is the placement to be determined. So when districts are just calling you up and saying, well, all students will be going back to school full time in the district, or whatever it might be, you have the right to say, I want to call an IEP meeting and look at whether this is what's best for my individual child. One of the things we've been harping on since the very beginning is the need for partnership. Again, that's always supposed to have been a central piece of the IDEA. And there are many families who have told us across the country that, in fact, this COVID-19 situation has allowed them to partner with education professionals in ways that they have never been able to before, that they have learned more about their student and what they're capable of, and the district personnel have learned more about how the student works at home, and the communication has been fantastic. Now, unfortunately, as I said earlier, receiving FAPE in the best of times is not always easy. And so during the difficult times, it's no surprise that has been a really uneven process across the country. There are some students and families who haven't hardly heard from the district and have not received any services whatsoever. Sorry about that. My girl is chiming in. Hopefully she'll lay back down in a moment. And Amy's going to talk a little later about tracking child's progress or loss, which is now, that data is now more important than ever. Again, COVID has presented unprecedented challenges for schools and families. There is no doubt about it, and for communities and for the larger systems that we live in and work in each day. But obligations under the law have not changed. I can't say that enough. The U.S. Department of Education has now made it clear that during COVID, schools remain responsible for ensuring that a free and appropriate public education is provided to all children with disabilities. And now, again, is the time to fully embrace the idea's required partnership and to think outside the box and be creative and figure out if there's, how we can meet student needs. And again, not if we will, but how we will. And there are many things we've learned through COVID that perhaps we knew before, but we never really had the chance to try it out. So for example, there are students I've heard that have been going hybrid, 2 days a week in school, 2 days a week at home on, virtual learning, and then one day where they're just doing self-study. And those students and their families have reported that they've made incredible progress, for example, on things like reading or math, where they may have been behind before because of the small group settings. Well, if we learned that during COVID, then that's something we should hopefully be able to carry through to that student's IEP and to their learning, how they learn best in the future. And, again, we're not just talking about having all the students with disabilities go in and having reading before the rest of the students. We still have the requirements for LRE and all the other provisions of the law that students should be educated in the least restrictive environment with their peers without disabilities to the maximum extent possible. So what does that word FAPE mean? It's really, again, the central guarantee of the individuals with Disabilities Education Act and also of 504. It's the provision of those special education and related services at public expense provided through individualized education programs or 504 plans. And in the IDEA, it's particularly or specifically specially designed instruction at no cost to the parent to meet the unique of the needs of the child with the verified disability. So we have to, again, schools must continue working under the constraints of the pandemics. And now, they're getting a lot of money from the COVID relief funds. So one of the things you might also want to do, Ed Week just had a great article that showed you how to calculate how much money your district will be getting from those relief funds, because there's some kind of course, in most funding bills, it's some convoluted formula to figure out how much states are getting and districts. So from that, and they have a lot of leeway. I have heard, districts that are using the funds to upgrade their buildings, to put air conditioners in, to put air purifiers in, to bring additional tutors in, there are no boundaries set by the federal government. So this is, again, an opportunity for the districts and parents to work together to figure out what is it that we need to provide a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. Andrew F., which was decided in 2017, is a seminal case that really, that's what's say articulated, but explained or reminded that the IDEA is that districts under the IDEA, have the obligation to offer a cogent and responsive explanation for their decisions with families. So when you come together at the IEP table, and districts used to, for example, let's say you bring in an outside evaluation or some data from a tutor that your child has been working with over the past year, and you say, I would like to have this same program used, for X amount of hours a week. The district can no longer just say, we don't do that, and move on. They need to provide a cogent and responsive explanation for their decisions and why that might be unable, or in their professional estimation, what other programs may exist. But the one thing that the court decisions that have come out, and there's only been a few, there's been some state complaint decisions as well, and they all reinforce this fact that the existence of FAPE does not relieve the district of their obligation under the IDEA. And in fact, if there are extreme failures to provide service or to just dismiss the needs of the child, that they may have to go as far as providing in-person services in the home, in the school, or one-on-one, whatever the child needs. Those are just some examples, certainly not something that every child is entitled to, but that, again, the schools are not getting a free pass now. And there are things that we may be learning throughout this process that will be helpful. A lot of this starts with understanding the child, of course, their unique needs, and what is appropriate progress. That is a term. The word appropriate is one that is central to the IDEA as well. And this emphasis on progress is something that Andrew F. again brought back to the forefront and really, again, emphasized that it's not sufficient to just move from grade to grade to grade, IEP to IEP, IEP, with no progress, with no, growth, and that the students are expected to make progress, not only according to their unique needs, but in alignment with their grade level standards and what their peers without disabilities are learning to the maximum extent. Here comes that word again, appropriate. So again, there's often a lot of discussion that needs to go on for the team to come to agreement about that, but those requirements have not changed. So we have to really make sure in this day and age, this appropriate progress is forefront, and you have to remember, because sometimes schools will not, that the standard is not whether your child has received any educational benefit in the past year. It's not whether they have regressed or lost skills, and it isn't to wait and see how your child is doing in the fall or when things are back to quote unquote normal. The standard is, what could your child or would your child have been able to do if not for the interruption of COVID? So where would they be in their learning? And so we've really got to the IEP team, of which of course you're to be a meaningful part of, and in partnership with the school, is to determine what kind of progress is appropriate, given your child's needs. And then, so some of this may be looking back at the kind of progress and data that you have, while still keeping data looking forward, which Amy's going to get into more specifically, but also then what programming and supports the school must provide in order to make that progress and to reach those goals, which must be challenging. So again, they're not, if they're the same goals that they've had for, pre-COVID and for 3 years, any impartial person that would look at that would question whether or not that goal was in fact challenging or designed specifically for the child. So what can you do to make sure all of this happens? We know that special education advocacy can be challenging. Again, it's been a tough year. There's a lot of drain on you, but there's also an opportunity on you to be more of a meaningful partner in your child's education. I've heard a lot of families saying that opening up IEP meetings to Zoom or to this kind of, whether it's Zoom or Google Meet or WebEx or whatever they use, has allowed them to feel like and to participate on a more even keel. And it's also reduced some of the stress of getting into the building and to go for meetings and, all those things. So there are things that, again, some silver linings in some of this, some things that you may have learned, but we have to, keep at it. And there's definitely a piece of the process that's critical, and that is data. And so I am going to now turn it over to Amy to talk about that, the keys to determining educational progress or loss.
Thanks so much, Denise.
Sure.
So data and I've really discovered this year, and probably some others have too, I would imagine, that it's always important to have data, to have documentation of how your child is doing and where we want them to get, what's appropriate progress for them. But during COVID this year, we've been able to see it up front a little bit more closely, a lot of us, if our children are learning remotely at least part of the time. But a lot of these principles we're going to be talking about now apply with the COVID situation, but then also just in general, in terms of collecting data, using that data and documentation to advocate for your child, throughout the rest of their educational journey. Next slide. So, starting point, whatever situation you have, whether they're in person, remote, partly, you always want to come with data and documentation in hand. This is something I've learned not just as a special education attorney, but also as a parent of kids in special education. I've gone to the IEP table back in the early days when I was just learning how to advocate and saying, my child struggles with this, or I feel my child needs that, but I didn't have in hand paperwork to really show, here's what's going on. Here's what we know my child can do. Here's what would be appropriate. Here's where they are now. And so once you really get into that habit of having data, of having documentation, of collecting that and preparing for IEP meetings, it can really make a tremendous change in your advocacy work for your child now, this year, and in future years. So gather as much information as you can to show the rest of the IEP team how your child has been doing throughout this pandemic period, especially if they've been 100% remote. You really want to say, okay, I'm gonna pull all this together and be able to come and say, look, things have changed perhaps. Maybe, maybe the child has regressed or really has made no progress. And you really want to get your ducks in a row as much as possible to share that with the rest of the team. So remember, in order to get to appropriate goals, in order to get the number of service minutes and the types of services and the types of accommodations that your child will need, the very first thing we have to do is find out where your child is now. And that takes getting into specifics and collecting as much data and documentation as we can. So next slide. There we go. So consider your child's academic needs specifically. You can take a look and say, okay, I'm going to think just about math or just about reading or just about test taking skills. Think about, has my child lost skills and actually, is not even in as good a spot academically as they were 12 months ago? Or perhaps, maybe they haven't lost skills, but maybe they're basically haven't made any progress, or maybe they've made a little bit of progress. And you want to really kind of try to get a sense of that. When you go to the IEP meeting, once your child's returning to school, or, when your child's due for the regular annual IEP meeting, you want to try, if you can, to do more than just say, my child is struggling and has lost skills and his reading level is not even as where we were 12 months ago. You want to have some paperwork to back that up as much as possible. And so our next slide will talk about some of the things that we can do and we can collect to try to make that happen. So how do we document that? So our next slide again. Thanks. So if your child is in full remote learning, they are probably submitting a lot of their work or 100% of their work through online apps. And I know there's a variety of them. One individual child might be juggling 5 or 6 different things and submitting it. So try to just work on getting some screenshots of this. If you haven't done that to date, start doing that now. You may be able to go back in and see and find and take just some screenshots and say, okay, what's their writing assignments they've been turning in? If your child is saving work and then having to upload it, or you're having to upload it for them, start collecting that. Also, if you go back in time, if you've kept some of the older work, especially from, pretty, close right before the pandemic started, so early 2020, if you have similar work samples, pull those too. So if you're a parent, and I know there are so many of us now that are saying we're losing skills, we're losing track of where we want them to be, to the extent possible, try to line that up, try to find some math worksheets or whatever, old tests that they've taken in a particular subject and say, okay, here's where we are now. Don't fret. I know a lot of people say, well, I don't keep it, or I had some and I threw it out. Start today. Start getting as much as you can to be able to show to the team, again, if your child has lost skills or just kind of flatlined and not made progress or not made appropriate progress to what you really think that they can or should do, you want to be able to come to the IEP table, whether it's in person or virtual, to really talk about that. Next slide. So, for example, I know a lot of parents are really concerned about, especially for children with specific learning disabilities, with dyslexia, or any child who's just, even attention deficit disorder, whatever their disability might be, that they've had maybe struggling to read. So if you're trying to capture that, maybe your child is not reading as fluently as they were, or just not being able to keep up with their peers and with the curriculum this year, you can even just take your phone, make a short video to say, look, this is, clearly my child is having, fluency issues, my child is having decoding issues. Whatever documentation and data that you can find to present that to the team is going to be helpful. As Denise said, there have been no IDEA waivers, so all of the laws under the IDEA and Section 504 still apply. So talk to them about conducting a reading evaluation remotely. There are certain types of assessments that can be done perhaps just as easily over Zoom or over whatever electronic platform there is. So really talk about that. If you're seeing problems, get that, request a new assessment. And as we always suggest, always do things in writing. It's much better to be able to show that you had emailed and asked for something, or you'd emailed the team or emailed the child's teacher or case manager and said, my child is struggling in this particular area. I think we need to assess. I think we need, additional or different types of services. Get that in writing so that later on, if there was an issue, if you weren't getting what you needed or what you'd asked for or what you'd expected, that you can say, hey, here's what I had requested. Next slide. So one additional thing that I want us to keep in mind, and this is what Denise was mentioning earlier, obviously a lot of families, have really been struggling for so many different reasons this past year during COVID, but there have been some kids that have not regressed. They have actually thrived, or at the very least done perfectly fine. They've made appropriate progress. So kind of as much as you can, consider what conditions and things in the child's environment have really helped with that. And you can take those concerns to the child's IEP team at the next IEP meeting and say, hey, I've noticed my child does well when he can take movement breaks. I've noticed my son, he likes to kind of stand up and he's fully engaged with the lesson, and see, okay, maybe it's just a little bit more movement, maybe frequent movement breaks might be helpful. Something like a graphic organizer, if you find that taking certain types of notes helps your child not only when writing an essay, but also with reading and helping following along.
Okay, well, I hope, I'm not sure. I think Amy just had to bump out and come back in, contrary to what it looks like. We're not in the same conference room. That's technology there. So she's coming in
Yeah,
from Nebraska.
it looks like Amy froze up, and I would imagine that she would be logging back in. So let's give it a minute or so. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can keep talking a little bit while we're waiting for her to come on. So,
Sure.
you know, again, I think that it's important that the same principles we were working on before are continue to be working on, but that, as Amy was saying, that we really want to hone in on. This is the opportunity for us to see how our students are doing. Some students in families have actually conveyed to us, for example, that they didn't, you know, when their child came home with an art project, for example, that they didn't really realize that their student had conceptualized what to draw from a more generic instruction. So they thought, you know, they didn't realize that they had those capabilities. And so now they were incorporating that into what they were doing on her free time, and also, you know, keeping that on in mind when they're talking about other subjects. So there are some things that you may learn and see about your child as they attempt to navigate, you know, specific classes and subjects that you haven't had the opportunity to observe before. So, yeah, let's see. Especially, I think, you know, the prevention of the behavioral challenges, that last line there on this slide, cannot be overemphasized. Unfortunately, excuse me, schools sometimes are, you know, obviously teachers, when they have 25 kids in the classroom, they're not as good at noticing the behavioral challenges prior to the, you know, so they can interrupt them, or to realize that the behavior happens almost exactly 15 minutes into the lesson every time. But if you give them a chance to take a break proactively, that outburst may not or will not occur. So, you know, I cannot overemphasize that. And with that, I see Amy is back. So I was just giving a couple more examples to illustrate this slide while you were logging back on.
That was great. So demonstrating in first person there, the difficulties that we've all probably experienced sooner, you know, once or twice through doing everything remotely. So, so if we could do that next slide. We will move on to, okay. So one of the things that may not always be obvious or clear is that the IDEA does not just address our children's academic needs and are they learning math and reading and all that, all of their academic subjects, but it also addresses their functional needs and their behavioral needs. All of the things that it takes for a child to access their curriculum are all implicated by the IDEA. So what we want to do is make note also, I was talking earlier about making sure we're collecting data and documentation to bring to the team about academic progress or regression or lack thereof. You also want to make note if your child is becoming really frustrated. I know there are a lot of kids with a variety of disabilities who have really struggled through trying to follow along with Zoom, follow along in the remote environment. And that can really pose a lot of difficulties. So what you want to do is to make note of that as much as you can to share with the team. Instead of just saying this year has been really difficult, we've had specific difficulties, make note of how often is it a concentration posing a difficulty? Is it that your child is just becoming very frustrated and showing negativity and in communicating with others, with their peers, or with the instructor. And then also think about times where some extreme problematic behaviors may be emerging. Is your child demonstrating self-injurious behaviors? Make a note of when that is. Are there certain triggers? Again, this has been such a difficult time for everyone, but at least you've gotten a little bit more insight. The one silver lining being you can perhaps say, okay, I see what the antecedent of that behavior is. I see what some of the difficulties are that have led to that. To share with the IEP team to think, okay, if we're going to experience difficulties with math, whether it's been happening at home or whether it's going to happen in the classroom once the child is back in, what can we do to try to positively support that child so that those behaviors don't occur or are reduced in frequency. Okay, next slide.
I think it moved, didn't it?
There we go. Okay, behavioral. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, it was having a little trouble there. I don't know why.
We got it. Okay. So again, if a big help with this is dates, if you're able to, basically make as many notes as possible about saying, again, these are this is what's occurring. This is when I see it happening, so that you can come to the team. It can be much more effective to say, my child has had a specific number of, if it's meltdowns or incredibly frustrating experiences. And this is when I'm seeing it happen, as opposed to just coming and saying, well, we're having these problems. And of course, I know it can be tricky because so many of us are juggling work and all the variety of challenges that are coming along with this year. But as much as you can, being able to communicate to the team, this is something that's happening once a week or every day, or, whatever the case may be. And don't forget, again, you under the law, you are a member of the IEP team just as much as any of the educational professionals are. And especially with COVID, you have that front row seat in a lot of cases. So you have your data, your information that you're bringing to the team is no less important, no less valuable than the data that is brought by team members throughout the process and in a typical year. All right, next slide. In the IDEA, children with disabilities have a right to, as appropriate, positive behavioral interventions and supports. And this is particularly important and particularly appropriate for children with, and this is quoting from the IDEA, whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others. So if they have behavioral challenges that are a function of their disability, then it is the responsibility of the IEP team, of the school, to come up with the appropriate supports to help your child learn. And some of you, and to kind of take us off of the slide just a little bit, some of you may be familiar with the disciplinary provisions in the IDEA, what's called a manifestation determination review, where a child has, if a child has violated a code of conduct, child is on an IEP, has a disability, the IEP team holds the manifestation determination review if the child is removed from the school setting for over 10 days. So if we've got a pattern of removals, child with disability has been suspended for more than 10 days. And if it's resulting from their disability, so if it's a child with autism who's having difficulty following school rules, then the school and your child's been forced out of school and been suspended because of that. The team has to do a functional behavior assessment. They have to put together a behavioral intervention plan to help give the child the supports they need, and so that the school isn't punishing the child for disability. So those are called BIPs, behavioral intervention plans. You may have some experience of having heard of that, but it's not only for when the child has quote unquote misbehaved. That's when the law requires it, if your child is being suspended multiple times. But you can also come to the team and say, my child has these challenges. It's due to their disability. We need to have a program in place, a set of procedures to help our child learn those skills, those behavioral skills, to eliminate or reduce those problematic behaviors so they can learn appropriately. Next slide.
Amy, can I add something to that before we move on?
Please do.
We've heard a lot of reports about, again, just as a reminder, this piece of IDEA, it has not been waived for the online environment. And so we've heard a lot of reports of students who've been removed from virtual classrooms. You know, they're creative, they mute them, won't let them talk. Some students have been removed into the waiting room during the middle of class and either left there for a couple minutes or left there for the whole entire of the class if the teacher thought they were being disruptive. So, you know, this protection, if the student, and some have actually been told don't show up for class. And again, from those court cases we've seen recently, the schools are required to provide the service and to be creative about how they're doing it. So there's no pass for, well, the student just wouldn't cooperate and sit online. Well, then what else are you going to do to provide that material to that student or to ensure that they have the opportunity to learn just like their peers do? So again, sitting and thinking about these principles as they apply to online, they haven't changed. So how do they, I guess the question is more about how do they apply if you're still in a virtual environment, or if you're, you know, school has not yet opened and your child is struggling.
Yeah, no, and that's such a good point to bring that to the team. And again, that's where any insight you have at all to say, here's what appears to be leading to this, getting the, you know, if the teacher has reached out to you or emailed to you saying there's these problems occurring, that's data, that's documents that you can share and say, okay, here's what's going on. The team, you included as a parent, need to work on crafting behavioral support so that child can learn appropriately and make progress. Okay. This is our section that applies obviously now as we've all been dealing with COVID, but also applies at any time. I tell clients that I work with, other parents, that the most important part, in my view, of the IEP, the time that you really want to spend your time focusing on when you're prepping for your child's IEP, is with the present levels of performance. It's the longer title is Present Levels of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance section of the IEP. Once we have really paid attention to saying, okay, here's the difficulties my child is experiencing academically, behaviorally, all the things that are going on, or also here's the strengths. Hey, my child is really improved in a certain area and made progress. And think about, okay, what is it that's led to that? Get specifics in there. Test scores, grades, the number of times that your child has eloped from the learning environment and has left or has had any type of frustrations. Get that information as much as you can into the present level. So when the team is all sitting around and saying, well, how's this child doing? You can articulate with specifics as much as possible. Once you have that in place, you don't want to gloss over that. It's in the IEP meetings that I work on with clients, that's our longest chunk of time, is working on the present levels. How is this child doing now? Then we have that in place. And then we can start looking at the remaining pieces of the IEP, and they really do just kind of click into place a little bit more easily than if we haven't spent a lot of time drilling down at the data and the specifics of how that's going. So again, if your child has not been in a school building for 12 months and maybe they won't be back till August, the teachers, haven't seen them in person for a year and a half at that point, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure that present levels is accurate. You want to make sure that it reflects, here's where the child is now. Then you can start building an appropriate program. You can say, okay, we know we know the child's abilities, maybe to a certain extent, hopefully. We know what type of progress is appropriate given this child's abilities and given the challenges that face this child due to the disability that the child has. But we can say, all right, here's where we really think they can get in a year. We're going to build those goals, and then we're going to say, okay, now we're going to look at what services and how much, what kind of related services, speech, occupational therapy, that kind of thing, and also the placement where that would best serve the child. So you want to get those specifics and don't let that get glossed over. That's your time to really say, here's what's going on with my child. That third bullet point, having specifics.
A question for you, and then a point. The question is, I assume you had said earlier, make sure you bring things in writing. So I would assume that whatever the parent wants to bring and add to the IEP should be brought in writing so that it can be attached to or included?
Yes, and so
Is that
when I say,
correct?
yeah, so so it's not necessarily something that will get attached to as part of the IEP document, but as you're all sitting around at the table, and I know sometimes it's an intimidating experience because you've got 10 professionals sometimes and you're sitting there as the parent, but what the idea is to say, here's my child's reading level specifically. Here's how they're doing with decoding. Here's how many errors they're making when they're reading, that kind of thing. Here's the comprehend, they're getting only 40% of comprehension questions correct. Bring that to the team and then get that put into the present level section. So what I mean by that is if you bring those scores in and say, hey, here's the grades they've been getting or whatever it is, have them type that into the present levels and say this child has, an error rate of X, or this child has eloped from whatever their learning environment is 7 times in the last month, whatever that is. So that's a really good question. Thanks for having that come up as a clarification. Yeah, so you want to get that included in terms of just writing down here's where they're. I've seen so many IEPs that are just really vague about how the kid is, and it's so hard to tell where they are, especially with the learning disability and reading. And that's something to really work on with the team. If you don't have documents, ask for them and say, hey, where's the test? Where the weekly or every 10 days there's a reading test? I want to see those scores and see, where they are. And again, a lot of times you will be met with, all kids struggle with taking tests. All kids find long division to be difficult, whatever the case may be. Always remember, is this challenge for my child? Is this difficulty related to their disability? It often is, right? If your child has ADHD, something like that, and they're having trouble with multiple steps and following all those directions, you can say, yeah, I understand that long division's hard, or that answering long, essay questions can be tough. But my child has disabilities that make it tough. And that's clear, all the testing that the school did when they said, yes, your child is verified for special ed, and come and say, okay, we need to accommodate the child for that specific difficulty that they experience due to the disability. Remember that when you're told everybody's having this problem. Okay, next slide. So we want to talk a little bit about equity, and I'll go through this kind of quickly here so we can hopefully get to some questions. When we think about equity, it's essentially what it means is fairness. With the IDEA, when parents do engage in dispute resolution, and when they do end up in litigation, essentially the argument is, my child has not received a free, appropriate public education, which is what the school district is required to do under the law. That's what they're required to provide a child with a disability who has an IEP. And so a remedy for that courts, this is not actually in the text of the statute of the federal law that Congress passed. Instead, courts have looked and they've said, okay, the child has not received FAPE for a variety of reasons. Maybe they haven't had the appropriate number of service minutes or the appropriate type of services. Maybe the program itself, the way that the child is being taught, isn't a right fit. It's not appropriate for them. Then they can say, all right, the child has not been able to make progress appropriately because they didn't have that appropriate education. Their compensatory services, compensatory education is a way to make up for that, to put the child in the place that they would have been if they had not had that loss of educational services. It may also be an IEP is good on paper, but it's not being implemented appropriately. So that's where we're looking. That's where that standard is in terms of, well, what do we do if a child hasn't received appropriate education? Okay, next slide. So these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but compensatory services can include for a child who has not received FAPE. And again, there's not a requirement of fault here. COVID was no one's fault. But if COVID has meant that the child has not received FAPE because they have not been able to access the services that they are due under the law, then your child is entitled to compensatory services, compensatory education, if they have not been able to make appropriate progress. Not only if they've regressed, but if they've not been able to make appropriate progress. So compensatory services can be more intense supports and services during the regular school day and school year, or a different type of programming that's more better suited for them, more appropriate. Additional educational services outside of the regular school day. It can also take the shape of ESY, or extended school year services during school, like during the summer. There's a variety of different ways that this can occur. And with COVID, we really need to start to step that up. It's not just like in previous years where if the school just did not provide appropriate services, that then there may be that compensatory remedy that's due that child. But now we're looking and saying, no fault here, but simply COVID has made it where the child could not access has not been provided that appropriate education.
Right.
Next
And
slide.
can I add one point to that as well? One of the things that I think is important for families to remember, because there's a lot of discussion going on right now about learning loss and learning recovery. And, in our minds, that's very similar to comp ed, but in the district's minds, it's not. And so sometimes they are offering things like, well, all students who missed out on some things are going to get 2 hours of tutoring as learning recovery. Okay, great. That might be something that you want to participate in and think will benefit your child, but it's not the same thing as what Amy's talking about, which is looking at your unique child and their circumstances and outlining if they've had learning loss or they haven't had the opportunity because no services were provided for 6 or 8 months to grow or to progress, and you want specific intensive supports or services. So don't fall for an offer of learning recovery that and think that they are now don't have the obligation that they, that it takes them off the hook, I guess, for the obligation of compensatory services if you really feel like your child has not been provided a FAPE.
And 2 additional points about that too. Depending on if you live in an area of the country where there's a lot of special education litigation, some states much more than others, compensatory education is kind of viewed as fighting words and saying, my child is due compensatory education services because he didn't or she didn't receive the services that, they were supposed to. I've seen some places refer to them as COVID services. That's fine. It's basically, it's those it's additional services, more intensive services to make up for the free appropriate public education that the child should have received but didn't. Whether it was somebody's fault or not, that's not a question. And also, again, regression is not what's required here. It doesn't mean to show that your child has lost skills. That's not the only way that shows that that's needed. Also, just an inability to make appropriate progress. And how do we know? Well, we look at the goals from and say, oh yeah, my kid couldn't make any of these, wasn't provided the appropriate supports. And one thing I want to mention too, a lot of schools, especially if you are living in an area where everyone has gone fully remote 100% of the time, the district may say, we are going to do a bunch of remediation in the fall or in April or whenever, when everybody's back in person, and that's going to help everybody. Okay, that may be true. Your child might benefit from that. That might be some good stuff. However, your child is if your child's in special education, if your child's been denied appropriate services because of COVID, and your child has a disability and has not been able to make appropriate progress, compensatory services is what would be called for in that case. So always remember, if they say everybody's getting help, everybody's going to get a review, all the kids, no matter if they have a disability or not. Well, the whole reason my child's in special ed, the whole reason we have IEP meetings is to say, okay, my child has a disability. There are some adverse effects on their education because of that. So what supports are we going to do and how are we going to compensate for this loss? So basically, think lost educational, not just academic skills, but functional ones too. Perhaps there are brand new behavioral challenges that have resulted from COVID. And again, that's why documenting it, bringing it to the team, saying, hey, we need this to be in the present levels of performance to say, okay, where are they now? Compare it to where they were a year ago to see, do we need to compensate here? And then also looking forward to say, okay, what's appropriate for them to get to in a year from now. Let's see. Let's look at the next slide. So again, if you're in that boat, bring whatever documentation you have that you can create. Go back now and try to find it. Email. If you've been to the developmental pediatrician and they've said, oh yes, parent said this, bring that. Share that with the team. Explain, my child is entitled to FAPE. COVID may have prevented this. Maybe try not to get into a back and forth argument. And even if it's nobody's fault, maybe everyone's been working really hard, maybe not, but maybe they all in good faith been working really hard. And to say, okay, how do we get my child to that appropriate spot? IDEA still applies. The federal rules are still in place. And so, we need that FAPE and we need those compensatory services as appropriate. At this point, really work with the team to try to, in an informal way at the IEP table, there are dispute resolution processes, state complaint, mediation, and due process if there's just not an ability at the table, at the IEP table, to make sure that your child is getting a FAPE and compensatory services. But at this stage, really try to work that out with the team, and data helps you do that so much. Okay, let's see, next slide. And I know we're coming up on time here. Okay, questions. Oh, you're muted, Denise.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop screen sharing if that's okay, because there were 2 resources I wanted to provide people that I can't do if I'm screen sharing. So is that all right with you, Katie? At this point,
that's
to
totally
stop
fine. Yep.
Okay,
And
cool.
I'm just going to quickly let all of our participants know, and I also put this in the chat box. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. I will, as quickly as possible, try to look through them and, pick some out. But we are unable to address very specific circumstances. So please try to keep your questions broad, whatever questions that you decide to put into that chat box. I do have one great question that just came through, if you guys are ready to take questions. And it is, how do you determine how long compensatory services should be provided?
I can take that one. That's actually a really good question, even when COVID's not at issue. There are 2 major approaches to this. Federal courts in different parts of the country differ. Some look at a quantitative measure and they say, okay, if a child has lost X number of hours of speech services or X number of hours of resource instruction, then okay, an appropriate remedy would be that same number of hours. More common than that is a qualitative approach that says, okay, let's look at the educational benefit that's been lost due to COVID, and or in just regular compensatory ed cases outside of the context of COVID, where we look and say, okay, well, what is it essentially? What educational benefits have they lost? It may be one-on-one with a tutor can recapture that and can compensate from that, versus what they would have gotten in a large classroom setting. So it's very individualized, but most places kind of take that qualitative approach. And it needs to take, extra services over a year or a month or whatever. It's really individualized.
Thank you. I did see a question regarding the PowerPoint. We will be emailing out a copy of the PowerPoint along with a recording, so you guys will have access to that after this webinar. Also, we will be providing a survey to provide feedback, so please feel free to provide feedback. I do have another good question here, and we just have a couple minutes, so I apologize. We're not going to be able to make it to all the questions, but this question says, are districts or schools required to provide a prior written notice if they decline to provide compensatory services? Our district has been difficult to obtain the prior written notice form.
And I can take that one. The district is required to give you prior written notice anytime you ask for anything and they say no, whether we're in COVID or any other time. The reason for that are there's a handful of times when the school team when the district has to provide you with prior written notice when they're making a change in something, when it's the child's evaluation, their placement, their program, but also any provision of FAPE. And I would argue that, and I think this is really commonly accepted, if the child has not been getting certain hours or has gotten hours but has not been able to benefit because they just can't work via Zoom or whatever, then if the team says no and they deny it, they have to give you prior written notice. They have to explain why they are denying the service, what you've asked for, whatever it is, and their reason under the law. There's a lot in the IDEA. There's a lot of points they have to fill, and that's in 5 years from now. If you're dealing with something totally different, unrelated from COVID, if you are requesting, if the team is changing anything, they have to document it and tell you why in a prior written notice. But also, if you ask for anything and they say no, they need to write it down, and that way down the road, if you ever do have to go to dispute resolution, you can say, here's what I felt my child needed for FAPE. The school said no. Here's what they said, and you would be arguing later on potentially that it was the wrong choice.
Okay, just time for one more question. What if a school says that there is no data, so they don't know how the child is doing because the child refuses to do much during the Zoom classes? What would you recommend?
Can I take that one? This is where you taking data becomes very important. I have a grandson who has Down syndrome, who's 8, and he doesn't like to participate in his speech sessions, although he normally does when he's in school, but he doesn't like to when he's on the camera. And so we were watching one day, or I was there one day, and my daughter was with him, and she said, every day he sits here for 10 or 15 minutes till the therapist comes online. And then by the time she gets on there, he doesn't want to participate, and he won't even look at her. And so we started taking data of that to show, well, why isn't he participating online? And because, I think he's very smart. And I think he was like, well, if you can't show up for 15 minutes, I'm certainly not going to do my part for 15 minutes. So, again, you have to do your part in collecting what data you know about what's going on. Or you have to ask, I would say too, that, you're entitled to ask for an assessment if there is no data to find out what level they're at now.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Denise and Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time to put this webinar together and for all of the great information that you shared today. And thank you to all of our participants for taking the time to join us. We are now at 3 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. But again, please keep an eye out because we will be sending out follow-up information to all of you so that you have access to all of the resources that we'll review today.
And can I just say quickly, I did put 2 links in. One of them is a new resource from the Center for Learning Equity that where it kind of takes you through examples of exactly what we've been talking about today and how to apply that to their service levels. And the other is Principles for Learner Equity that we came up with along with other organizations. So I just popped those in the chat box.
I'll see if we can include that in our follow-up email as well so that everybody can get that in their inbox too.
All right, great. Thank you, Katie.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Be safe, and thanks for joining today. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.